In the spring of 1865, a man walked back onto a Louisiana island that had been burned to the ground. Edmund McIlhenny was almost 50, a banker with no bank. His fortune turned to worthless paper, living on his wife's family's wrecked land because he had nowhere else to go. He had lost everything, and he would not be the last man in his family to give it away. His eldest son would build the business, then leave it to charge up a hill in Cuba. His second son would pour the profits into saving a dying bird. His grandson would come home a decorated Marine and refuse the fortune that going public would have made him. 5 generations on, 130 of their descendants still own every share and still will not sell. This is the story of the family that kept refusing to cash out on the same 3 miles of salt. If you love the stories where the glamour has a cost hidden underneath it, stay with me and consider subscribing, because this one runs long and it turns on a single stubborn choice made over and over again across 150 years. Chapter 1. The Strangest Hill on the Gulf Coast. There is a hill in the Louisiana marsh that should not exist, and the same family has held it for more than a century and a half. Drive south and west out of New Iberia, through cane fields flat as a table, and bayous the color of weak tea, and the land does not rise. It is not supposed to rise. This is the deep coastal marsh of the Gulf, a country of water and grass, where the highest thing for miles is a line of moss-hung oaks or the levee a road sits on. The horizon lies down flat in every direction, and the sky takes up most of the world. And then, without warning, the ground lifts. It climbs to a green crown 163 feet above the sea, the highest point on the entire Gulf Coast, a dome of oak and bamboo and camellia standing over the flat water like something that wandered in from another state and forgot to leave. The people who first named it thought it was an island, because in the wet season, the marsh closed around it and made it one, and the name has stuck ever since. They were closer to the truth than they knew. What lifts that hill out of the marsh is not soil. It is salt. Beneath the oaks and the gardens sits a plug of solid rock salt the size of a mountain, a buried dome pushed up from far underground over unimaginable stretches of time, until it raised the whole surface of the earth above it into a hill. The dirt and the trees are only a skin stretched over the top of it. Underneath is a mountain of the oldest and plainest preservative in the world, the whitest and most ordinary of substances, and everything that has ever happened on that hill has happened because of what lies buried under it. The salt is the reason for all of it. It is the reason a Confederate army once fought to hold this ground, and the reason a Union army came to take it and smash it. It is the reason a ruined man could build a business here when he had nothing else, because the one thing the burned island still gave him for free was the mineral that keeps things from spoiling. It is the reason the little glass bottles that leave this place today still carry, in their recipe, salt dug from the same dome that fed the armies of a lost cause. One substance runs through the whole of this story, and it changes its meaning every single time it appears. First it is glory, the wealth of a nation at war. Then it is ruin, the thing that draws down the fire. And in the end, it is simply endurance, the mountain that would not let go, the ground the family kept standing on when every reason in the world said to walk away. The name on those bottles is Tabasco, and almost everyone alive has seen it. The little clear bottle, the thin red sauce, the green cap, the diamond label with a man's signature printed across it. It sits on tables in nearly 200 countries. It has ridden in soldiers' ration kits to war. It is one of the most recognizable products the modern world has ever made. And yet, the family that makes it, the family that has made it on this exact hill since the years just after the Civil War, is one that almost no one outside Louisiana can name. That is the first strange thing about them. They made a household word and stayed strangers. They built a thing the whole earth would recognize and kept themselves invisible behind it. They kept something else too, something rarer than fame. They have never sold the company. They have never taken it public, never floated it on any exchange, never let a single share of it out of the bloodline. Roughly 130 of them own it today, cousins and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the man who started it, and not one of them can cash out to a stranger because the family has spent a century and a half quietly, stubbornly refusing to let that happen. In an age when nearly every family firm in America was eventually sold, floated, swallowed, or split apart among heirs who wanted their share in cash, this one held together and held on, generation after generation, and would not sell. Think for a moment about how strange that combination really is. The bottle sits on the counter of a roadside diner, and on the table of a state dinner, in an army mess, and in a 3-star kitchen, on nearly every continent and in nearly every language. And it has done so for longer than almost any living person can remember. It is one of the small, fixed constants of the modern world, a thing so ordinary that no one thinks about it at all. And behind it, on a single green hill in a Louisiana marsh, sits a private family kingdom of a kind that has all but vanished from American life, a company owned by no bank and no fund and no stranger, run by the blood descendants of one ruined man, planning its future not in the quarters that rule ordinary business, but in the span of whole centuries. The people who run it now like to say that they make a 100-year plan, knowing full well that not one of them will be alive to see it finished. That is not the way fortunes usually think, and it is certainly not the way the Gilded Age thought. Hold that phrase, the 100-year plan, because everything in this story bends toward it in the end. That refusal is the strange thread of this story, and it runs against everything the Gilded Age is remembered for. The great fortunes of that age are remembered as engines of ruin, money that swelled and then dissolved, dynasties that raised marble palaces and emptied them again inside 3 glittering generations, names that meant the summit of American wealth and then meant nothing at all. This is the opposite tale. It is the story of a family handed the same kind of American fortune who chose, again and again, at every single point where selling would have made them rich and comfortable, not to. And it begins with the least likely founder imaginable, a man the age had already broken once, standing on this green hill with nothing left to his name, in the ashes of a war he had backed and lost, looking at a few red pepper plants growing wild in a ruined garden. Chapter 2. A self-made man at the top of a doomed city. Before the war took it, Edmund McIlhenny had built exactly the life a poor Maryland boy was supposed to dream of. He was born in the autumn of 1815 in Hagerstown, Maryland, the second oldest of 9 sons in a family that was comfortable rather than grand, of Irish and Scottish stock. His father, John, was a merchant and a tavern keeper who dabbled in local politics, the kind of man whose many sons were expected to go out into the world and make their own way, rather than inherit a place already made. And Edmund learned early, in the hardest possible manner, how quickly a comfortable world can drop out from under a boy. On his 17th birthday, the day itself, his father died of the cholera that swept the country that year. The disease was the terror of the age. It could take a strong man in a single day, doubling him over by morning and burying him by night. And it took John McIlhenny on the exact anniversary of the day his son had come into the world. Whatever softness the family's small prosperity had promised, the boy ended there, at a graveside, on a birthday. The child who marked his coming of age beside his father's fresh grave grew into a man who understood, in his bones and beneath all reasoning, that security is a thing you build yourself and can lose in an afternoon. He went south to build it. Around 1841, at 26 years of age, Edmund surfaced in New Orleans, the loud, rich, dangerous capital of the whole cotton world, a city where fortunes were made on credit and lost on fever, and the Mississippi carried both away with the same indifference. It was one of the great boom towns of the earth in those years, a port where the cotton of half a continent came down to be sold and shipped, thick with money and speculation and yellow fever, a place a young man with a head for figures and no fear of risk could rise fast or drown quickly. Edmund took a job as a bookkeeper at the Bank of Louisiana, a clerk among clerks, and he began to climb. He had a gift for figures and for the long, slow, patient arithmetic of money, and within a few years he was a general agent for the bank, riding a circuit of its branches across the lower part of the state, through Baton Rouge and St. Francisville, through Donaldsonville and Opelousas and Alexandria. He came to know every kind of money there was in that country, the planter's paper and the merchant's notes, and the way a single bad cotton season could turn a rich man poor between one autumn and the next. Then he did the thing that clerks dream of and almost never manage. By the late 1850s, he had bought the very branches he had been managing for others and set himself up on his own account, an independent banker with his own capital and his own name on the door. The number he recorded for himself tells the size of what he had made. In the year 1860, Edmund McIlhenny put his personal worth at $112,000. In the money of that day, it was a genuine fortune, the kind that would be counted in the millions now, something on the order of $2.5 million in the terms of our own time. He was named on the published lists of the most eligible bachelors in New Orleans, a self-made money man near the very top of a booming city, a man who had turned a dead father and a clerk's stool into wealth, and standing by nothing but the strength of his own patience and nerve. And a man in that position, in that city, married accordingly. In the summer of 1859, at St. James Episcopal Church in Baton Rouge, Edmund married Mary Eliza Avery. She was the daughter of Judge Daniel Dudley Avery, a man of the landed sort, of old Louisiana family with property and social standing, and among that property was a strange green island down in the marsh south of New Iberia that the family had held for years. The marriage joined Edmund's bright new money to the Averys' deep old land, and it is the hinge on which everything that follows turns, though not a soul at the wedding could have guessed it. Because the one asset the Avery family truly brought to the union, the one thing that would outlast the banks and the war and the whole fortune Edmund had built with such care, was that island and the mountain of salt buried underneath it. It is worth seeing the city he had conquered, because the shape of it explains the man. New Orleans in those last years before the war was a place of almost feverish wealth and almost casual death, the busiest cotton port on the continent, where the crop of half a slave-holding empire came down the river to be weighed and sold and loaded onto ships for Liverpool and Le Havre. Money moved through it in torrents, most of it borrowed, all of it riding on the price of cotton and the labor of the enslaved. And death moved through it just as freely, in the yellow fever that came with almost every hot summer and carried off thousands at a time, so that a man might be rich in June and buried in September, and everyone knew it, and the city danced anyway. To rise in that place, to become a banker whom other men trusted with their money, a man had to be cool and patient and unafraid of risk in equal measure, had to be able to look at a world that could vanish in a fever season and go on lending and building regardless. Edmund McIlhenny had learned all of that. He had learned it so well that he had made himself a fortune in the middle of it, and he had every reason to believe, in that last golden year, that the coolness and the patience would carry him and his family safely through whatever came. The island his marriage brought him into had a long life of its own before he ever set foot on it. The French had called it Petite Anse, the Little Cove, and the salt springs that seeped up through its ground had been known and used for generations by the native peoples before the settlers and by the settlers after them, who boiled the brackish water down to salt in small quantities the way coastal people always had. The Avery family had come to hold the place and to work its springs, a green rise of good land in a country of marsh, valuable in a quiet, ordinary way for its timber and its fields and its trickle of salt. No one yet knew what truly lay beneath it. No one had dug down to the solid mountain of rock salt that the springs were only the faint surface sign of. When Edmund married into the family and gained a claim on that ground, he gained it as a pleasant piece of Louisiana real estate, a wife's family holding, nothing more. The thing that would save his life and found his dynasty was still buried and unsuspected 16 feet under the soil, waiting for a war and a shovel to bring it up into the light. They began their life together at the very top of the world they knew. Edmund had money, a wife from a good family, a place in society, and the run of the richest boom city in the American South. Their first child, a daughter they called Sadie, was born in the autumn of 1860 at the island, where Mary Eliza had gone to be near her own people for the birth. 8 children would come to them in all across the years, though 2 would die as infants, a grief so common in that century that it was almost expected of a family, and never, for all that, any lighter to bear. In the last full year of peace, Edmund McIlhenny had everything a careful man could want, and had built the most of it himself, from nothing, starting with a graveside on a birthday. He was approaching 50 years old. He had his $112,000, a wife and a house full of children, a name and a future. And he was about to lose all of it, every dollar and every certainty, because the whole rich cotton world his fortune stood on, the entire glittering economy of the lower Mississippi, was about to go to war and burn to the waterline. Chapter 3. The salt that fed an army and marked them for ruin. The same salt that would one day preserve his source first made the island the most dangerous piece of ground in Louisiana. To understand why, you have to remember what salt actually was in the middle of the 19th century, before refrigeration, before canning was common, in a country about to try to feed 2 enormous armies in the field for 4 long years. Salt was not a seasoning then. It was the difference between a slaughtered animal and a starving one, between an army that could march and an army that could not. Meat that was not salted rotted within days in the heat. Salted, it would keep for months, ride in a wagon 1,000 miles, feed a soldier through an entire winter campaign. The armies of that war moved on salted meat, and an army that could not salt its meat could not fight. And the Confederacy, cut off by the Union blockade from the sea salt and the foreign imports it had always leaned on, discovered within the first year of the war that it did not have anywhere near enough, and that the shortage could lose the war all by itself. The Avery family island held an answer, though at first even they did not grasp how large an answer it was. Judge Avery had restarted the old practice of boiling the island's brine springs down to salt late in 1861. A slow, small operation. Men feeding fires under great kettles and evaporating the salty water down to crystals the way salt had been made along that coast for generations. It was a modest wartime effort to meet a sudden and desperate demand. Then, in the spring of 1862, digging on the island struck something that changed the scale of everything at a stroke. 16 feet down, the shovels hit solid rock salt. Not brine to be laboriously boiled, but the salt itself, sitting in the ground, a bed of it, almost perfectly pure, some of the purest ever found, the first rock salt mine in North America. They did not have to make the salt any longer. They only had to dig it out of the ground and load it onto wagons. What followed was a frenzy. By the autumn of that year, 10 separate pits were being worked across the island at once. Between 400 and 600 men laboured around the clock, cutting and hauling by day and by torchlight, and the road onto the island filled with wagons come to carry the salt away, as many as 500 teams queued at a time, waiting their turn on a hill made of the very thing every kitchen and commissary and army in the south was crying out for. The numbers that came off that island in those months are staggering for a single small place. In 11 months, it shipped more than 22 million pounds of salt. The price of salt across the blockaded Confederacy had by then climbed to something near 4 cents a pound, roughly 16 times what it had cost before the war, and here was a whole mountain of it being cut out of the earth and sent north and east to the fighting fronts. The governor of Mississippi wrote to the president of the Confederacy that salt for the entire cause was there, on that island. The governor of Alabama bought 155,000 pounds of it in a single purchase, for something over $6,000. Individual states were assigned their own pits to draw from. The salt went to Vicksburg and to Port Hudson, and to the strongholds of the Eastern Confederacy. And one of the Avery sons was excused from military service altogether so that he could stay and run the operation, because that salt was worth more to the war than one more rifle in the firing line. And it is here that the story has to stop and be honest about the ground it stands on, because the salt did not cut and haul itself. The men who tore it out of those pits in that frenzied year, in the heat, around the clock, were not all free labourers. Much of that terrible work, the hardest and most dangerous work on the island, hauling salt for an army fighting to keep them in chains, was done by enslaved people, held by the Avery family and hired in from others. The fortune this family would one day build began on a hill whose first great wealth was cut by the hands of the enslaved. That fact does not belong at the edges of the story, mentioned once and set aside. It belongs underneath it, in the same ground as the salt, and any honest telling leaves it exactly there, load-bearing, where it actually sits. It is hard now to feel how desperate the want of salt had become across the wartime South, so it is worth making it concrete. In the blockaded Confederacy, salt grew so scarce and so dear that ordinary families dug up the dirt floors of their own smokehouses, the soil soaked with the drippings of years of salted and smoked meat, and boiled that earth down to recover the salt trapped in it. Whole communities went without, and the meat they could not preserve spoiled and was lost, and the armies in the field felt the shortage in their rations and their sickness. Against that backdrop of a whole nation scraping its smokehouse floors, the sheer abundance of the Avery Island is almost unimaginable. Here was salt, not by the handful, but by the mountain, nearly pure where it was cut, so clean it hardly needed refining, coming out of the ground in tonnage that no other source in the south could touch. Men worked the pits by torchlight through the night, the fires throwing shadows up the walls of the diggings, the wagons churning the approaches to deep mud. The whole island turned into a single vast enterprise for tearing white salt out of the dark and sending it to the war. For a year, this one small hill in the marsh was very nearly the salt cellar of a nation at war, and everyone on both sides of that war came to understand it. There is a phrase from that war for what the island had become, and it fits. Salt was the white gold of the blockaded South, and the Avery Island was the richest single seam of it anywhere in the Confederate country. That is why one of the Avery sons was pulled out of the fighting ranks and given an exemption from military service to stay home and run the pits. a thing the hard-pressed Confederacy did not do lightly, granting a strong young man leave from the army because his labor at a salt mine was worth more to the war than his rifle in the line. And it is why the loss of the island, when it finally came, was felt in the Confederate armies as a real wound and not merely the burning of one family's property. When the salt stopped flowing off that hill, the shortage bit harder everywhere it had been reaching, in the commissaries and the field kitchens and the sickbeds, one more thread cut in a supply system that was slowly strangling. The little green hill in the marsh had become, for a time, a genuine pillar of a nation's ability to keep its armies in the field, which is a very large thing for one small island to be, and a very dangerous thing to be sitting on top of. And the very thing that made the island so precious made it a marked place. A mountain of salt feeding the Confederate armies was never going to sit undisturbed in the middle of a war for its own survival. The Union knew what was there, and knew what it was worth to the enemy. Late in 1862, the first blow fell, a probe by water that the island managed to turn back, 2 gunboats and a transport that came up through the bayous and could not force the position. It was a reprieve, and every soul on the island understood that a reprieve was all it was. The salt that had made them rich in the middle of a war had also drawn a hard circle around them on a Union map. The army would come again, and the next time it would come in strength, overland, and there would be no turning it back with a few guns on the shore. The wealth in the ground had become a summons. Somewhere to the north, a column was already being readied to march on the richest little hill in the Confederacy and to leave it a ruin. Chapter 4. They fled the island with nothing but the people they owned. In April, the Union came for the salt, and the family ran for Texas ahead of the guns. The second blow was no probe. In the spring of 1863, as part of the wider federal campaign to break the Confederacy's grip on the lower Mississippi country, Union troops moved on the island by land, in force, and this time the position could not be held. The soldiers who took it understood precisely what they had come to destroy, and they went through the salt works with method and thoroughness. They wrecked the mining equipment, the steam engines and the windlasses that lifted the salt out of the pits, the machinery that had turned a hole in the ground into a supply line for an army. They burned the buildings, 18 of them by the count that comes down to us. They scattered 600 barrels of finished salt across the ground, spilling into the mud, the very thing the whole South was starving for. In a single operation, the most important salt source in the Confederacy was smashed flat, and the war rolled on and left the wreck of it behind. The family did not stay to watch it happen. As the Union advance came on, the Averys and the McIlhennys gathered what they could carry and fled west, toward Texas, away from the fighting, refugees now instead of landowners, their wealth and their world coming apart behind them. And here again, the story keeps its hard honesty, because when the family ran, they did not run alone or empty-handed. They took with them, by the accounts that survive, dozens of the enslaved people they held, driven west along with the wagons and the household goods, as though those men and women and children were part of the property being carried out of the enemy's reach. The flight that the family would afterward remember as their own hour of loss and suffering was, for those people, one more forced march in a life that had never once been theirs to direct. Both things are true, and both belong in the same breath. The war ruined the McIlhennys, and the thing the war ruined had been built, in part, on the labor and the bodies of people the McIlhennys owned. Edmund himself spent the war years scattered and steadily diminished. He was too old for the firing line and too useful with figures to waste on it, so he served the Confederacy as a civilian, first as a clerk in a commissary office over in Galveston on the Texas coast, and then in a paymaster's office. counting out a currency that was quietly, month by month, turning back into paper. It was a bitter posting for such a man, a banker without a bank, a rich man watching his own kind of wealth die in his hands, because that is what the war did to the fortune he had built. It was not stolen from him in a single dramatic night. It evaporated, slowly, the way water leaves a shallow pan. The banks he had bought and run collapsed as the Southern economy came apart. The Confederate money, in which so much of Southern wealth was held, became, by the war's end, worth exactly nothing. Engraved sheets you could paper a wall with and not buy a loaf of bread. The $112,000, the careful accumulation of a whole hard-climbing lifetime, thinned to almost nothing as the cause he had put his faith and his capital behind went down in fire. When the war ended at last in the spring of 1865, Edmund McIlhenny came back to the island, and there was almost nothing left to come back to. The plantation was wrecked and looted. The famous salt works were a ruin of scattered barrels and burned timber and broken iron. His fortune was gone. His banks were gone. The money he still held in hand was worthless, and he was a man approaching 50 with a wife, a house full of children, and no capital and no prospect anywhere, living on his father-in-law's broken land because there was nowhere else on the whole earth for him to be. Picture him standing on that green hill in the first weeks of peace. He had begun with a dead father and a clerk's stool, and climbed, over 20 patient years, all the way to a fortune and a place among the notable men of the richest city in the South. And now he was back at the very bottom of the ladder, older, tireder, greyer, with a family looking to him to feed them, and every single thing he had built turned to ash and paper behind him. The war years themselves had been a slow humiliation for a man of his kind. Down in Galveston, in the commissary, and then the paymaster's office, Edmund had spent his days handling the money of a cause that was quietly going bankrupt, counting out Confederate notes that bought less every week, a banker reduced to a clerk, watching the whole edifice of Southern wealth that he had climbed so carefully turn to smoke around him. He was in his late 40s by the war's end, an age at which most men of his time were thinking of easing toward rest, not of starting over with nothing. When the surrender came, and the family made its way back home to the island, they came back to desolation. The great salt works that had been the pride and the danger of the place were a wreck of scattered barrels and blackened timber. The fields were untended. The comfortable, prosperous world of 1860 was simply gone, and no amount of coolness or patience could conjure it back, because the money it had been counted in no longer existed. Picture what the ruin actually meant for a household, not as an abstraction, but as a daily fact. There were children to feed, a wife to keep, a place to hold together, and no income and no capital and no bank to draw on, in a defeated and occupied region where money itself had come apart and trust with it. The whole Southern economy was a wreck in those first years after the war. Cash scarce, credit gone, the old certainties overturned, and into that hard landscape came a man near 50 who had once commanded a fortune and now commanded nothing. Everything he had known how to do, the banking, the lending, the moving of money, belonged to a world that no longer existed. The skills that had made him rich were worth little on a burned plantation in a broken country. He had to become, in effect, a different kind of man entirely, a maker of a physical thing rather than a mover of paper. And he had to do it late in life, from nothing, with mouths depending on him. That is the pressure that was on him in the wrecked garden. It was not curiosity that bent him down to look at those pepper plants. It was need. That is the true beginning of this story. Not a comfortable rich man deciding to dabble in an amusing hobby, but a thoroughly ruined one, with no way up and nowhere left to go, standing on a burned island whose only remaining wealth was the plain white mineral in the ground beneath his feet. What a man does at that exact moment, at the very bottom, with nothing and no one to catch him, tells you more about who he is than all his prosperous years put together. And what Edmund McIlhenny did, in the ruin of everything, was walk out into the wrecked kitchen garden behind the house and crouch down beside a few red pepper plants that had come up wild and stubborn among the destruction, and begin, slowly, quietly, with no plan and no capital and nothing left to lose, to think. Chapter 5. A patent, a cologne bottle, and 658 bottles of sauce. He planted a crop of red peppers because it was the only thing the ruined ground would still give him. The exact origin of those peppers is one of the points where an honest teller has to slow right down and separate what is truly known from what has been smoothed and prettified by more than a century of retelling. The family and the legend have offered several versions over the years, and they do not all agree. In one, a traveller or a returning soldier, back from the fighting down in Mexico, pressed a handful of pepper pods or a few seeds on Edmund, a spicy curiosity carried up from the south. In another, a New Orleans planter named Mounsell White, who was already growing and sourcing a similar hot pepper before the war, gave him the plants and the idea outright. Historians who have gone looking for hard evidence of that gift have not been able to find it, and White himself died in the war years, so the tidy story of one man handing another the whole secret has very little solid ground beneath it. What is genuinely documented is smaller and stranger and more human than any of the legends. Sometime in the years just after the war, on the island, Edmund McIlhenny had capsicum peppers growing, small and red and violently hot, and he began, patiently, to experiment with what a ruined banker might do with them. What he did with them was reach for the one thing the island still had in abundance. He crushed the ripe red peppers to a mash, and he mixed that mash with salt from the island's own buried dome, the very same mineral that had fed the armies and drawn the Union column down on them. He packed the salted mash away in vessels and let it age. Then he stirred in vinegar and let it age again, and strained the result through sieves until what came out was a thin, red, blazing liquid, a few drops of which could set an entire plate alight. It was, at bottom, a way of taking the most perishable thing imaginable, a ripe pepper that would rot to slime in a matter of days, and using salt and thyme and vinegar to turn it into something that would keep for months in a sealed bottle. It was, in its way, exactly the trick the whole island had always turned, the trick the salt had always performed. Salt against decay, permanence pulled out of rot. The banker had become a man preserving peppers with the same white mineral that had once preserved an army's beef. The scale of the first years was almost touchingly, painfully small. In 1869, Edmund produced and sold his first real batch of the finished sauce, and the whole of that first year's production came to 658 bottles. He sold them wholesale, $1 apiece, to grocers along the Gulf Coast, and he had no proper bottles to sell them in, so he used whatever he could lay his hands on. He gathered up second-hand cologne bottles, the little clear glass vessels that a lady's perfume came in, and he corked them and sealed them over with a daub of green wax. There is something almost unbearably human in that picture, and it is worth holding still to see it. A former banker, a man who a few years earlier had been worth the equivalent of millions, going around a wrecked island collecting used perfume bottles to hold a pepper sauce he was making by hand, one small batch at a time, and carrying them off to sell to grocers $1 at a time. This was not a wealthy man's idle amusement. It was a broke man's business, built out of the only materials a broke man had, which were red peppers, island salt, cast-off glass, and an enormous unbroken patience. But it grew, and the numbers climbed so steeply in those early years that they are worth laying down side by side to feel the slope of them. 658 bottles in that first year of 1869. A little over 1,000 the next year. Nearly 3,000 the year after that. And then, in 1872, more than 15,000 bottles in a single year, the whole business more than doubling and doubling again as word of the strange, hot Louisiana sauce spread up the rivers and out along the coast and into the northern cities. The pepper fields spread right along with the sales, from a mere handful of acres to dozens of them, a red harvest coming in each autumn to be mashed and salted and laid down. And in 1870, Edmund did the thing that turned a homemade recipe into a piece of property that could be defended and inherited. He took out a United States patent on his process, the government's paper that said this particular method was his and no one else's, and he gave the sauce a proper name. At first, he had simply called it after the island's old French name, Petite Anse. Then he changed it to something with more music and more mystery folded into it. A word said to come from an Indian tongue of Mexico, meaning a place where the soil is damp. He called it Tabasco, and the name has never changed since. The patience of the process is worth dwelling on, because it is the founder's whole character distilled into a method. This was not a sauce a man could make in a hurry. The mashed peppers and the island salt went down into vessels and stayed there, aging, for weeks and then longer, the salt slowly drawing the fire and the flavor out of the fruit, the mixture mellowing and deepening in the dark of the warehouse before a drop of it was ever fit to bottle. Only then came the vinegar, and then more aging still, and only after all of that the straining and the bottling and the wax. The patent Edmund took out spelled the method out in careful particular, the measures of salt and vinegar to the pulp, the weeks of maceration, the whole slow chemistry of it. It was the work of a man who had learned, in banking and in ruin both, that the things worth having are the things that take time and cannot be rushed, that value is laid down slowly and kept by patience. He was building, without any grand words about it, a product whose very nature was the opposite of a quick return, a thing that had to be waited for. The whole family, in a sense, was already there in that first slow recipe, in the refusal to hurry, in the willingness to wait far longer than other men for a thing done properly. Getting the sauce made was one thing, and getting it sold across a broken and enormous country was quite another, and here too, the old banker's instincts served him. He could not carry the bottles north himself, so he found men who could. He struck an arrangement with a New York agent to handle the sauce across the whole northeastern trade, and a large New York grocery house became his single biggest buyer, ordering the bottles by the thousands once the strange, hot Louisiana sauce began to catch on with northern palates. It was a real business relationship, with real friction in it, and the partnership with his northern agent eventually broke down in a dispute in the middle of the 1870s, the ordinary rough and tumble of a growing enterprise finding its feet. But the trade held and grew regardless, because the thing itself was good, and there was nothing else quite like it. A sauce with a genuine fire and a genuine keeping quality that travelled well and lasted long and improved a plain meal. Edmund had made a product that sold itself once people tasted it, and he had the sense to build the plain, unglamorous machinery of agents and orders and shipments that carried it out into the world beyond the island. He protected the thing, and he pushed it outward with a shrewdness that showed the old banker was still very much alive inside the sauce maker. He found agents to carry the bottles into the northern cities, chief among them a New York man who happened to be a former Union officer and a distant relation of his wife's family, and who took the sauce into the shops and groceries of the whole Northeast. A large New York grocery house became his single best customer and ordered more than 10,000 bottles in 1 year. By the middle of the 1870s, the sauce had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, going out to England and to France, with a sales office opened in London to handle the European trade. Hold the two ends of that arc in your mind at once. A man who 6 or 7 short years earlier had been standing in the smoking ashes of everything he owned, worth nothing, near 50, had built, out of nothing more than red peppers and island salt, and used cologne bottles, a thing that was selling by the tens of thousands and reaching clear across an ocean. It should have been the proudest achievement of his life, the redemption of the whole long fall. And the strangest part of the entire story, the part that tells you the most about who Edmund McIlhenny really was underneath, is that as the sauce grew famous, he seemed steadily, quietly, to lose all interest in claiming it as his own. Chapter 6. The founder who never once claimed the thing he made. By the time the sauce reached New York and London, Edmund had stopped talking about it almost entirely. The business went on climbing without any noise at all from the man at the centre of it. The northern agent worked the cities. The London office worked the coast of Europe. The best customer in New York reordered by the thousands, season after season. And the production numbers, which are the truest and coldest record any business keeps, kept right on rising through the 1870s and into the 1880s, past 20,000 bottles in a year, past 30,000, until near the very end of Edmund's life, the island was turning out more than 41,000 bottles of Tabasco sauce in a single year. What had begun as 658 bottles in second-hand perfume glass had become, inside 2 decades, a genuine going concern with an ocean-spanning trade and a name that was starting to travel farther than the man who made it ever would. There is one surviving scrap of Edmund's own private voice from these years, and it is worth holding gently, because it is very nearly all we have of the man's true feeling about the thing he built. In a letter to his wife in 1870, he passed along, with obvious and rather touching pleasure, a report that had come to him from one of the men out selling his sauce. Against his old rival's product, the Maunsell White Essence, his own sauce was winning, and winning easily. The seller had said, Edmund wrote to Mary Eliza, that he sold 25 bottles of the McIlhenny sauce for every single one of the other man's. It is a small, warm, entirely human line. A ruined man allowing himself one quiet moment of triumph, the sound of someone who has been all the way down at the bottom letting himself believe, cautiously, almost shyly, that the thing he built with his own hands out of wreckage is beating the competition in the open market. For the length of one letter to his wife, you can actually hear him enjoying it. And then, around that one warm scrap, the silence. Because here is the fact that has puzzled nearly everyone who has ever studied Edmund McIlhenny, the fact that makes him one of the strangest founders in all of American business. He did not, in the end, seem to regard Tabasco as the thing his life had been about. Late in his years, he sat down and wrote out an autobiographical sketch, an account of himself and his doings for his family, the sort of summing up a man makes when he wants to leave behind a record of who he was and what he had done in the world. And in it, he did not mention the source, not the invention, not the patent, not the growing trade, not the name that would outlive him by centuries. He wrote about his banking, his family, his circumstances, his life, and he left the little red bottles out of the account entirely, as though they were a sideline hardly worth the ink it would take to describe them. And when he died, the obituaries that marked his passing did very much the same thing. They noted the banker, the family man, the respectable citizen. Of Tabasco, the thing that would one day carry his name into nearly every country on the face of the earth, They said essentially nothing at all. Sit for a moment with how genuinely odd that is. Here was a man who had invented, from absolutely nothing, in the smoking ruins of his own lost fortune, one of the most recognizable products the modern world would ever produce. His signature would one day be printed across hundreds of millions of bottles every year, and he treated it, in his own careful accounting of his own life, as barely worth a single line. There is no vanity in it anywhere, no visible sense that he believed he had made something that would last, nothing of the founder's pride we would expect. Perhaps to a man who had once been a banker worth a great fortune, a pepper sauce made in cast-off cologne. Bottles always felt like the thing he did when he was down and broken, rather than the thing he truly was. Perhaps the wound of that great loss in the war never fully closed over, and the sauce, however well it came to sell, was always in his own mind, the small second act of a man who measured himself forever against the grander first. Whatever the true reason, the founder of Tabasco went to his grave without ever really claiming the thing he had made, and that refusal to boast, that strange quiet, is the first appearance of the trait that would define his whole line. There may be something else in the silence besides modesty or an old wound, something harder and more interesting. Edmund had spent his best years in a world where a man's worth was a number in a ledger, where you were what your account said you were, and he had watched that entire world burn and had learned, in the hardest possible school, exactly what such numbers were worth when the ground shifted under them. Perhaps a man who had once been rich on paper and then watched the paper turn to nothing had simply lost his taste for measuring a life by what it was worth on the market. Perhaps the source, to him, was never the point at all, only the means, the plain, honest work that fed his family after the grand, abstract wealth had failed them. He had learned the difference between a fortune you can count and a thing you can actually hold in your hand and use. And he seems to have decided, in the quiet of his last years, that the second kind was the only kind worth having and not worth boasting about. Whatever the truth of it, he built one of the great brands of the age and treated it as a private matter, and in that refusal to trade on it, to inflate it into legend even in his own memoirs, his descendants would one day recognize the very first move in the long game their whole family would play. And there is one last small irony folded into the founder's modesty, one that he could never have known. The very signature he scrawled at the bottom of his letters and his papers. The ordinary handwriting of a private man who did not think his source worth mentioning in his own life story would become one of the most reproduced signatures in the history of the world. To this day, it is printed across the label of every single bottle that leaves the island, the name Edmund McIlhenny riding out on the front of the product hundreds of millions of times a year into nearly 200 countries, in dozens of languages. The man who would not claim the source in his memoirs signs every bottle of it still, a century and more after his death, whether he would have wished it or not. His descendants made his signature the mark of the whole enterprise, turned his private name into the public face of the thing, so that the founder who kept so quiet about what he had built is now, in the most literal way imaginable, the most visible thing about it. He wanted no monument. His family gave him the largest one a maker of a small thing can have, printed on the neck of every bottle in his own hand. He died in the late autumn of 1890 at his home on the island, 75 years old. He had come to that hill 25 years earlier with nothing at all, and he left behind him a working business, a family provided for, and a name that was just beginning its long journey around the world. And the size of what he left, stated in the cold, flat terms of evaluation, tells the whole improbable story in a single figure. When his widow and his children put a value on the entire operation at the time of his death, the source and the recipe and the patent and the equipment, the whole of it together, They set it at $14,250. That is what Tabasco was worth in 1890, in the honest ledger of the very family that owned it. A modest sum, a comfortable enough inheritance for the children, and no more than that. What no one standing in that room could possibly have known was that they were holding, at $14,000, the small, hard seed of a fortune that would still be entirely theirs 130 years later, unsold, undisclosed, and grown beyond anything the old banker in his grave could have dreamed. He had built the thing and refused, right to the very end, to make anything of it. Now it passed into the hands of a son who would build it far higher, and then, at the height of it, walk away to go and get himself shot at on a hill in Cuba. Chapter 7. The Heir Who Abandoned the Fortune to Go to War. John Avery McIlhenny ran the company for 8 years, and then, at the very height of it, he handed it away to go and get shot at. He was Edmund's eldest surviving son, born in 1867, a young man of the new generation who had grown up alongside the source rather than inventing it out of ruin. And when his father died in 1890, John took the business firmly in hand at about 23 years of age. He had none of his father's strange reticence about the product, none of the old man's tendency to look past it. He ran straight at it. Over the next 8 years, he modernized the little operation, pushed the source harder and further into the market, and leaned into promotion in a way the founder never had the taste or the temperament for. In one of the more remarkable strokes of early advertising anyone attempted in that whole era, he commissioned a touring stage production, a comic opera built around the very name Tabasco, and sent it out around the country, so that audiences in theaters far from Louisiana would hear the strange word sung from a lit stage and carry it home in their heads. It was brand building decades before anyone had thought to use the phrase, and it worked. Under John, in a few short years, the family source grew from a regional curiosity into something much closer to a national name. And then, in 1898, at the peak of running a healthy and fast-growing family business, with everything a young man of means could possibly want laid out neatly in front of him, John Avery McIlhenny walked away from all of it to go to war. When the Spanish-American War broke out that year, he resigned his place at the head of the company and enlisted in the volunteer cavalry regiment that a rising young politician named Theodore Roosevelt was raising for the fight. The regiment the newspapers of the country would soon make famous as the Rough Riders. He did not have to go. Nothing compelled him. He was a man of property, past 30, running a prosperous company, exactly the sort of man who could have watched the whole war from a comfortable and respectable distance and been thought no worse of by anyone. He went anyway. He put down the source and the ledgers and picked up a carbine, and he shipped for Cuba with the volunteers. What he did there was not the safe or ornamental soldiering that a rich volunteer of that day could usually arrange for himself if he wished. He fought, and he fought in the worst of it. He was in the sharp, ugly little opening battle at Las Guasimas in the Cuban brush, and he was there for the assault on the heights above Santiago, the desperate uphill charge that the whole country would ever after remember and mythologize as San Juan Hill. He rose through the ranks right there in the field, from an ordinary trooper to a sergeant, and then, for gallantry under fire, to a lieutenant's commission. And he did all of it while sick, carrying the measles and the malaria that ran like wildfire through the crowded camps and the fever-ridden campaign, fighting his way up a hill in the brutal Cuban heat with the fever already burning in his blood. His commander thought highly enough of him to set it down for the permanent record. By his high qualities and zealous attention to duty, Roosevelt wrote afterward, McIlhenny speedily rose to a sergeantcy and finally won his lieutenancy for gallantry in action. From the pen of the man who would within a few years be the President of the United States, written about the young heir who had left his sauce company behind to come and fight. It was about as clean and as generous a piece of praise as any soldier could ever hope to earn. Here is where the family thread first shows itself plainly and unmistakably, and where you begin to understand that the founder's strange refusal to cling to his own fortune was not a single peculiarity of one odd man, but something that would run down in the blood. Edmund had built the sauce and then quietly declined to make anything of it. Now his son had inherited a comfortable, thriving, growing fortune, and at the very moment it was fully his to sit back and enjoy, he had put it down entirely to go and risk his life on a hill in Cuba for a cause and a country. The image of it is almost too neat to be true. The young owner of a peaceful and profitable sauce business, charging up a fire-swept slope in the tropics, while, back home on the quiet green island, the little red bottles went on selling themselves by the tens of thousands without him. But it happened exactly so. John Avery McIlhenny had the whole fortune held safe in his 2 hands, and he opened them and let it go to do something harder and far more dangerous, and he came home from it a decorated hero of the single most famous American regiment of its age. The regiment he joined was itself one of the strange and vivid creatures of that moment in American life, and it says a good deal about John that he chose it. Roosevelt had thrown together his volunteer cavalry out of the most improbable mixture of men the country could supply. Hard-riding cowboys and ranch hands from the Western Territories thrown in alongside polo players and college athletes from the Eastern universities. Frontier lawmen beside the sons of old money. All of them drawn by the romance of the thing and by the sheer magnetic pull of the man leading it. Into that mixture rode a Louisiana sauce heir, a man who could have bought his way to safety and chose instead to sleep in the Cuban mud alongside cowboys and be shot at with the rest of them. And it is worth remembering what he had walked away from to do it. Only 4 years earlier, he had been dreaming up that touring comic opera, sending the name of the family sauce singing across the stages of the country, a young man of promotion and ambition and peacetime cleverness. Now he had put all of that down to carry a carbine up a hill under fire. The distance between those 2 versions of the same young man, the impresario of a sauce opera and the fevered lieutenant on San Juan Hill, is the exact measure of what he was willing to give up. And it is worth remembering that he did not fight from behind a comfortable desk or a safe rank bought with money. He fought sick, in the field, in the worst of it. The camps and the campaign of that Cuban war were a swamp of disease, and the measles and the malaria moved through the volunteers as surely as the enemy's bullets, killing and weakening men who had never seen a battle. John carried both fevers and went up the hill anyway, burning with sickness in the killing tropical heat, doing the work of an officer while his own body was failing him. More American soldiers died of disease than of Spanish fire in that short war, and a rich volunteer who could have gone home at the first fever and been thought sensible for it, instead stayed in the line and led. That is the texture of what he chose. Not the clean heroism of a painting, but sick men crawling up a hot hill under fire, and a sauce heir among them who had every reason to be somewhere else, and was not. The man he had followed there, Roosevelt, would ride the fame of that same hill all the way to the presidency of the United States within 3 years, and would carry John up into the government with him. The war made him, and it turned the whole course of his life away from pepper sauce and towards something else entirely. He came back from Cuba a public figure, a rough rider, a man with a name and a future in the wide national world, and he would spend the rest of his working life not on the island quietly compounding a fortune, but out in the service of the state, following the very commander he had charged that hill for into the machinery of national power. It would carry him to the legislature and then to Washington, and finally, far more troublingly, to a small and troubled country in the Caribbean where the honest part of this family's story turns genuinely dark. But the company, the source, the growing fortune, all of it, he had left behind him in 1898, the day he sailed for Cuba, handing the running of Tabasco down to the younger brother, who would turn out to be the strangest and most remarkable McIlhenny of them all. Chapter 8. A Soldier in Washington and the Shadow over Haiti. The war made John a hero, and public service made him into something a good deal more complicated. He came home from Cuba with a name, and he spent that name in politics and government for the whole of the rest of his working life. He served first in the Louisiana legislature, in the lower house, and then in the state senate through the early years of the new century. Then his old commander, Roosevelt, by then the president, brought him up into the national government, onto the United States Civil Service Commission, the body charged with the long, unglamorous, genuinely important work of reforming the vast and often deeply corrupt machinery of federal hiring, of prying government jobs loose from the grip of the political bosses and putting them instead on the honest basis of merit. He served on that commission for 13 years, through the administrations of 3 different presidents, a long and by most accounts diligent and reforming tenure, spent trying to make the government of his country cleaner and fairer in the way it chose and paid its own people. For a good stretch of his life he was, by the standard of the day, a model of the reforming public servant, the soldier turned honest official. And then his career carried him to the one place where the family story simply cannot be told as clean heroism, and should not be. After the First World War, John was sent by the State Department as a financial advisor to Haiti, the small black republic in the Caribbean that the United States had occupied with its Marines and would go on to run, in all but name, for years. His role there was to manage the country's money, and in that role he wielded a hard, high-handed, and largely unchecked power over a sovereign nation that had never asked for him or his advice. In one of the well-documented episodes of his time there, during a dispute with the Haitian government, John McIlhenny suspended the salary of the Haitian president himself, using his control over the nation's money as a blunt lever against the elected head of the very country he had been sent to help. It was the arrogance of the whole occupation made suddenly personal and concrete. An American financial officer reaching over and switching off a sovereign president's pay to bring him to heel. He was not universally admired for any of it, and the sharpest surviving judgment came from a man whose word carried real and lasting weight. James Weldon Johnson, the writer and civil rights leader, who went to Haiti and investigated the American occupation and reported on what he found there, wrote of John McIlhenny that his unfitness, by both training and experience, for the delicate and important position he was filling, was one of the most generally admitted facts. It is a cold, precise, devastating sentence, and it is the honest counterweight that has to be set against the Rough Rider glamour, the necessary reminder that the same physical courage that had carried a young man up a hill in Cuba could, 20 years on, harden into the casual, careless dominance of a small nation by a large and powerful one. The family's story touches, right here, the uglier machinery of American power in the wider world, and a full and honest telling does not look away from it or wrap it up neatly in the flag. John McIlhenny was genuinely brave. He was also, in Haiti, an instrument of something that deserves the plain and unflattering word for it. And both of those things were true of the same man at once. He left that post in the early 1920s and retired at last to a quiet farmhouse in Virginia, an old soldier and old public servant come home to rest out his years. He lived on well into the Second World War, dying in 1942, and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery among the nation's honored dead, the Rough Riders' ending rather than the businessman's. He had run the sauce company for only 8 of his 75 years of life, And here, quietly, folded into the end of his story, is the single detail that matters most for the thread that runs through this whole saga. When John Avery McIlhenny walked away from the company in 1898 to go to war, and then spent the entire long remainder of his life in politics and government and Caribbean occupation, and never once came back to run the family business, he never sold his share of it. Through all the decades in Washington, through Haiti, through the long, quiet retirement in Virginia, he held his ownership in the McIlhenny Company to the very end of his days. He had given up running it. He had not given up owning it, and he did not pass it out to strangers. He kept it in the family and carried his piece of it, undivided and unsold, all the way to his grave at Arlington. It matters, for the honesty of the story, to understand what the American occupation of Haiti actually was, so that John's part in it can be seen clearly. The United States Marines had landed in the country in the middle of the 1910s and would stay for nearly 20 years, running the little republic's finances and its public works and its armed forces, rewriting its constitution to suit American interests, and reviving an old forced labor system that put Haitian peasants to work on the roads at gunpoint, work that helped feed a bloody rural revolt against the whole occupation. It was, by any plain reckoning, the domination of a poor black nation by a rich white one, dressed up in the language of order and financial guidance. And John McIlhenny, the decorated hero of San Juan Hill, sat near the top of the financial side of it, an advisor with his hand on the country's money, powerful enough to switch off a president's salary in a dispute. When James Weldon Johnson went down to see the occupation for himself and came back to write about the men running it, his judgment of John's unfitness was not a stray insult, but the considered verdict of a serious man looking at a serious wrong. The same courage that made John admirable on a Cuban hill made him in Haiti simply one more instrument of a thing that deserves no softening, and both truths have to be carried together, or the man is not being seen whole. The tragedy of it, if that is the word, is that John's work at home had been genuinely good. The Civil Service Commission he served on for 13 years existed to fight one of the great quiet corruptions of American public life, the old spoils system under which government jobs were handed out as political favors to loyal supporters, regardless of whether they could do the work. The reformers wanted those jobs given on merit instead, to people who earned them by examination and ability, rather than by whom they had helped elect. And it was slow, unglamorous, decent work that made the government of the country cleaner and fairer by inches. John spent 13 years at it, under presidents of both parties, and by the ordinary measure he was a useful and honourable public servant, which is exactly why Haiti sits so strangely beside it. The same man who spent over a decade trying to make his own government fairer to its own people went abroad and helped run a small foreign nation with a heavy and high-handed grip, switching off a president's salary in a quarrel. He could see the injustice of the spoils system at home and be blind or indifferent to the far larger injustice of the occupation abroad. That contradiction is not unique to John McIlhenny. It ran through the whole of his confident, expanding, self-assured country in those years, and he simply carried his share of it. That distinction between running the thing and owning the thing, between the daily work and the deeper loyalty, is the exact place where this family stands apart from almost every other great fortune of its age. John was the first of them to show it out in the open and plain. He left the company entirely, and he kept his share of it to the death. And his leaving in 1898, the day he set down the sauce to take up a rifle, did one more thing that would shape absolutely everything that came after. It handed the running of Tabasco to his younger brother, a restless, self-taught, half-wild young naturalist named Edward, who had already very nearly died once at the frozen top of the world, and who would turn out to be the man who truly built the modern empire, and then spent a great share of its money on something that no one who knew him could have predicted. Chapter 9. Before the Source, a shipwreck at the top of the world. The man who would run Tabasco for 50 years nearly died at 22, on the ice, watching his ship go down beneath the Arctic Sea. Edward Avery McIlhenny, called Ned all his life, was Edmund's second surviving son, born on the island in the spring of 1872. And from boyhood, he was made of something restless and wild that neither of the other men in this story quite shared. Where his father had been a careful man of ledgers and quiet accumulation, and his elder brother a soldier and a public servant, Ned was a naturalist to the very bone, a collector, a hunter, a boy who wanted to know the name and the habit of every bird and beast and plant on the island, and then, having learned them all, wanted urgently to go out and find the ones that were not there. He grew into a young man of enormous physical appetite and enormous nerve, and before he had anything at all to do with running the family source, he went looking for the hardest, coldest, emptiest place on the map that he could possibly reach. In 1894, a college-aged Ned signed himself onto an Arctic expedition, one of the amateur scientific ventures of that whole age of polar obsession, when the far north was the great blank space on the map, and reaching it was the age's equivalent of reaching the moon. The expedition was led by a physician and explorer named Frederick Cook, a man whose name would later become badly tangled in the great and bitter disputes over who had truly first reached the North Pole. Ned went along as the expedition's birdman, its ornithologist, sailing north on a steamer called the Miranda, alongside a professor of natural history from Kansas, who served as the party's official naturalist. They left New York in the first week of July, bound for Greenland and the high cold latitudes, a whole shipful of scientists and adventurers and dreamers steaming up toward the very edge of the known world. And the Miranda, almost from the very beginning of the voyage, was a doomed ship. She met the ice within days of leaving harbour. Not 2 full weeks out of New York, in thick fog off the northern coast of Newfoundland, the Miranda struck an iceberg in the murk. The blow staved in 3 of her iron bow plates, tearing open the hull a good 15 feet above the waterline, and it was only that height above the sea, that narrow margin, that kept the wound from sending her straight to the bottom then and there. They patched her as best they could with what they had aboard, and pushed on north regardless, because that is simply what men on such expeditions did in that age, and for a time it seemed she might carry them through after all. She reached the coast of Greenland. The party went ashore, collected, explored, did the work they had come north to do. And then, in the second week of August, leaving a settlement on that coast called Sukatoppen, the Miranda drove hard onto a submerged reef, and this time the sea came in below her. The hull was breached beneath the water, and she began to leak faster than her pumps could ever answer, settling by degrees into a sea that kills a swimming man in minutes. What followed is the kind of ordeal that most men live an entire long lifetime without ever once touching, and Ned McIlhenny met it and came through it at 22 years of age. With the ship steadily filling under their feet in some of the most dangerous waters anywhere on Earth, the expedition's leader and a party of volunteers took to a small open boat and rowed for help. A desperate journey of roughly 140 miles through the frigid northern sea, to reach a harbour where an American fishing schooner named the Rigel lay at anchor. They found her, and they persuaded her captain to come back for the others. The schooner took the passengers off the sinking Miranda, plucking them from the dying steamer, and then she tried to tow the crippled ship south towards safety and a port. But the wound in the hull was mortal, and the tow could not be held against the sea, and in the end the line was cut, and the Miranda was left to her fate. She was last seen going down in the small hours of the morning at 61 degrees of northern latitude, in the cold grey water between Greenland and Labrador, taking with her to the bottom the entire scientific harvest of the whole voyage, hundreds of bird skins and dozens of mammal skins and a barrel of carefully collected bones, the professor's entire season of labour, all of it gone into the black and freezing dark. Think about what that wreck actually cost, beyond the ship. The whole point of such an expedition was the science, the specimens, the careful gathering of the far north's birds and beasts and bones to carry home to the museums and the universities that had helped pay for the voyage. All of it went down with the Miranda. The Kansas professor lost his entire season of labour to the sea, hundreds of bird skins, dozens of mammal skins, a whole barrel of collected bones, months of patient work sunk in an afternoon in the cold water between Greenland and Labrador. For most young men, a first great adventure that ended in a sinking ship and a lost year of work and a 140-mile row for their very lives would have been quite enough of the Arctic to last a lifetime. Ned went back. 3 years later, he was up at Point Barrow, at the very roof of the continent, wintering over in an old refuge station through the long polar night, and when a party of whalers was trapped there by the ice with their supplies failing, it was Ned who went out into the dark and the cold to hunt game and keep them fed and alive through to the spring. One of the men he saved being a wandering Japanese adventurer as far from home as a man could get. There was something in him that did not merely survive hardship, but sought it out, that went looking for the edge of the world, and then, having nearly died at it, turned around and went straight back. There is a strange footnote to that first voyage, one that Ned could not have foreseen. The man who led the expedition, Frederick Cook, would go on to become one of the most famous and most disputed figures of the whole polar age. Years later, Cook would become one of the most disputed figures of the whole polar age. His claim to have been the first man to reach the North Pole fiercely challenged and never settled, leaving his name one of the great question marks of exploration history. That was the man at the head of the sinking Miranda, a bold and charismatic and slippery figure whose whole life would turn on questions of what was true and what he had merely claimed. And sailing under him, as a young unknown bird collector, was a McIlhenny, a member of the one family in this whole story whose defining trait would be the refusal to claim more than they had, the founder who would not even boast of his own source. The young man survived the wreck of the boastful man's expedition and went home to a family that measured itself by not overreaching. It is only a coincidence of a passenger list, but it is a telling one. Ned survived it. He came home from the wreck of his first great expedition alive, and instead of curing him forever of the North, the disaster seems only to have deepened the hunger in him, because 3 years later he went straight back, this time to the very far top of Alaska, to Point Barrow, where he leased an old government refuge station and wintered over among the ice, and where he ended up sheltering and feeding a party of whalers who had been stranded by the freeze, hunting game through the long polar dark to keep them all alive. And among the men he saved was a wandering Japanese adventurer who had washed up at the edge of the world by much the same restless road that Ned himself had. This was the man, hard and capable, and half in love with the wild and dangerous corners of the earth, who came home to Louisiana at the very end of the century to find that his brother had ridden off to the war in Cuba and that the family sauce company was now his to run. He was no careful banker like his father, and no soldier statesman like his brother. He was something rarer and stranger than either, a naturalist with the iron nerve of an Arctic explorer and the driving will of an empire builder, and he was about to take the little red bottle and turn it into a genuine fortune. and then do something with that fortune that would astonish everyone who thought they knew him. Chapter 10. He took a condiment and built an empire. When his brother rode off to war, Ned McIlhenny came home to a sauce company and set about making it a thoroughly modern one. He took over the running of the business in 1898, and he brought to it the very same driving, restless energy that had carried him twice to the top of the world. He reorganized the firm from the ground up, gave it the name that it still carries to this day, the McIlhenny Company, and set about turning his father's careful handmade process into a standardized modern operation, the same sauce every time, made at scale, packed and labeled and shipped with real method and discipline behind it. He was a natural and tireless promoter, far more so even than his elder brother, and he pushed the Tabasco name outward through every channel the new century put in front of him. When radio arrived in American homes, he was among the very early advertisers to seize on it, sending the name of his sauce out over the air and into the parlors of the country. He fussed over the product's presentation with a jealous owner's care, and in the 1920s he made the change that fixed the bottle in its modern and final form, replacing the old cork with a screw top and refining the diamond-shaped label that still marks the bottle today, the little red diamond that any eye on earth now knows on sight. The pepper fields spread wide across the island to feed the growing trade. The acreage that had been just a few acres in the founder's first ruined years spread out across the island, to dozens of acres and then to hundreds, a great red harvest coming in every single autumn to be mashed and salted and laid down in the island's warehouses to age. The sauce that had once been counted in the hundreds of bottles, then in the tens of thousands, was now counted in numbers that would have simply astonished the old banker in his grave. A true American brand, with a national and increasingly an international reach. Under Ned, across the long span of years he held the company, roughly half a century all told, Tabasco stopped being a regional Louisiana curiosity altogether and became a fixed thing in the wider world, found in kitchens and restaurants and hotels across the country and far beyond its borders. The fortune the founder had valued so modestly at $14,000 became, in this restless second son's hands, something very much larger and very much more secure, a real and substantial family wealth. And Ned himself, running all of this, remained the most vivid and contradictory personality the family ever produced. He never once stopped being the naturalist he had been as a boy. He turned a large stretch of the island into a private garden of the whole world's plants, acres upon acres of azaleas and camellias and irises, of bamboo and papyrus brought from the far ends of the earth and coaxed into thriving in the wet Louisiana heat, a place he called Jungle Gardens and, tellingly, opened to the public, so that ordinary people who would never own such a thing could walk through a rich man's collection of the earth's green wonders. He was a serious scientist in his self-taught amateur way, and over some 30 years he personally banded birds by the hundreds of thousands, fitting small metal rings to their legs and setting them free so that their long migrations could be traced across the map. More than 250,000 birds ringed by his own two hands, one of the great private scientific efforts of its entire kind. He wrote books on the birds and the alligators and the old folk songs of the island's black community, and he told tall tales as freely as he breathed, including a cheerful claim to have shot an alligator 19 feet in length. A subspecies of deer found on the island was formally named in his honor. He was vain and boastful and inexhaustible, and genuinely gifted all at once, a man who ran a sauce empire with one hand and chased the living natural world with the other, and never seemed to tire of either. The gardens were only the most visible of his obsessions. Ned was a genuine, if entirely self-taught, man of science, and he pursued the natural world with the same relentless energy he brought to the sauce. His bird banding was a serious contribution to a young science, a way of learning where the birds went when they vanished each season, and he ringed them by the hundreds of thousands over 30 years, patiently, one small metal band at a time, so that a bird released from his island might be found again a continent away, and its long secret journey finally traced. He wrote and published books on the alligators he had hunted and studied since boyhood, on the birds of his sanctuary, and, revealingly, on the old spirituals of the black families who lived and worked on the island. Songs he set down as he heard them. He was forever telling stories about himself, some of them surely taller than the truth, including a cheerful boast about an alligator 19 feet long, and he filled his days with more projects and enthusiasms than most men attempt in 3 lifetimes. He was, in short, a very great deal of man, vain and generous and tireless and impossible to ignore, running a growing company almost as a sideline to the pursuit of everything that swam or flew or grew on his strange green island. Yet for all that he treated it as a sideline, his mark on the sauce is everywhere you look at a bottle today. The founder had made a handmade thing, sold in whatever glass came to hand. Ned made it a modern branded product, the same in every bottle and instantly known by sight. He fixed the little bottle in the form the world still recognizes, trading the old cork for a screw top and refining the red diamond on the label into the crisp emblem it remains, a shape so simple and so consistent that it became a kind of visual signature for the whole thing, readable across a crowded shelf in an instant. He carried the name into the new century's new machinery, sending it out over the radio waves into American homes at a time when advertising itself was still learning what it could do. He standardized the making of the sauce so that a bottle bought in one city tasted exactly like a bottle bought 1,000 miles away, which is the whole quiet secret of a great brand, the promise that the thing will always be the thing. The founder invented the sauce. The son invented the brand, the modern machine of sameness and recognition that carried a small Louisiana product out onto the tables of the world and kept it there. The money, by this point in his life, was real enough to do very nearly anything that a rich man of the age might dream of doing with it. Ned could have spent it the way the great rich men of his time spent their fortunes, on marble mansions and steam yachts, and the countless glittering ornaments of a great house and a great name. He had the means, if not to live like the very grandest of the Vanderbilts, then certainly to live like a lesser prince of that gilded world. And the truly remarkable thing, the thing that lifts this whole story up out of business history and into something stranger and finer and harder to forget, is what Ned McIlhenny actually chose to do with the profits of the little red bottle. Because in the very same years that he was building his fortune, a beautiful white bird was being slaughtered clean toward extinction across the marshes of the Gulf, killed by the thousands and the hundreds of thousands to decorate the hats of fashionable women in far-off cities, and Ned McIlhenny looked hard at what was happening on his own doorstep, and he decided to spend his sauce money to try to stop it. Chapter 11. A feather worth more than gold, and a bird down to 8. In the very years Ned was building his fortune, women's hats were driving a bird toward extinction. To see how, you have to look up at the heads of the fashionable women in the great cities of the Gilded Age, at the hats they wore to be seen in, and above all, at what those hats were made of. It was the great age of the feathered hat, when no lady of any standing considered herself properly dressed to go out without a spray of plumes rising in glory from her head, and the most prized plumes of them all, the ones that fetched the highest prices in the whole trade, were the long, delicate, snow-white nuptial feathers of the egret. These are the fine trailing plumes the bird grows only in the breeding season, when it is courting a mate and raising its young, and in the language of the millinery trade they were called egrets, and they were worth a fortune by their weight. At the very height of the craze, egret plumes sold for something on the order of $32 an ounce, which was more than twice the price of gold itself, ounce for ounce, so that a bird carried on its own back in the tender season of its courtship, a substance the market valued above the precious metal men tore mountains apart to find. The way that value was harvested out of the living birds was as cruel as anything the whole era ever produced, and the era produced a great deal of cruelty. The plumes are at their very finest and fullest precisely when the birds are gathered close together in their great nesting colonies, breeding and sitting on eggs and raising their newly hatched young. So that, of course, is exactly when the hunters came. They went into the crowded rookeries in the breeding season and shot the adult birds down off their own nests, stripped the fine white plumes from the warm bodies, and left everything else where it fell. And in every raided colony they left behind them the nests still full of chicks, the young and helpless birds whose parents had just been shot for the feathers on their backs, to starve slowly to death where they sat waiting to be fed. It was slaughter at the single most defenseless possible moment in the whole life of the species. The killing of mothers and fathers over the heads of their own young, all for the ornament of a hat to be worn to a party. And the sheer scale of it beggars the modern imagination. In one single year, the feather auctions of the City of London alone accounted for the deaths of something like 200,000 egrets, 200,000 birds killed in their nesting season, to feed the trade of just one city in just 1 year. Across the marshes of the American South, the great white colonies that had stood and nested there for uncounted ages simply began, one after another, to fall silent and vanish, shot out, emptied, gone. This is the Gilded Age in its purest and its cruelest form, the exact thing this channel exists to look hard at, the terrible human and living cost hidden underneath the beautiful gilded surface. On the surface of it, a beautiful woman in a beautiful hat, moving through a warm and glittering ballroom, an image of pure grace and wealth and refinement, of everything the age wanted to believe about itself. And underneath that same image, at the far and unseen end of it, a marsh gone utterly quiet, a rookery full of corpses drying in the sun, a whole generation of chicks dead of starvation in the nest. The white plume nodding on the hat and the starved chick lying in the swamp were the very same event, seen only from its two opposite ends, and almost no one who ever wore the feathers to a ball saw or troubled to imagine the far end of that transaction, the shot parent bird and the silent, emptied colony, the price paid in full in a wild place they would never in their lives go near. It was not as though no one was trying to stop it. The slaughter of the birds for fashion had begun, by the turn of the century, to stir the first great American movement for the protection of wildlife, much of it led by women who refused to wear the feathers and organized against those who did. A federal law, passed in 1900, made a first halting attempt to choke off the trade in illegally killed birds, though it was thinly enforced for years. The fight over the feathered hat became, in a real sense, one of the opening battles of American conservation itself, a struggle over whether a beautiful living thing existed for its own sake, or merely as raw material for an ornament. But laws are slow, and fashion is fast. And while the arguments went on in the cities and the capitals, the birds kept dying in the marshes by the tens and hundreds of thousands, and the great white colonies kept falling silent one after another. It would take more than a law on paper to save the egret. It would take, in at least one place, a single, stubborn rich man deciding to do it himself. The strangeness of the trade is worth holding in the mind for a moment longer, because it is so hard to credit now. A feather, ounce for ounce, was worth more than twice its weight in gold. Not a jewel, not a metal dug painfully out of a mine, but a spray of feathers grown by a wild bird in the ordinary course of raising its young. The great feather auctions of London and Paris moved these plumes by the ton, and the money in them was enormous, enough to send hunters into the remotest swamps of the world to shoot the birds off their nests. It was a whole global industry built on the breeding plumage of wild birds, and it drove several species toward the edge of extinction to decorate the heads of women who had, for the most part, no idea at all where the feathers on their hats had come from or what had been done to get them. The fight against it, when it finally came, was led in large part by women themselves, who organized and refused to wear the plumes and shamed those who did, turning the feathered hat from a mark of elegance into a mark of cruelty. It was one of the first times in American life that fashion itself was put on trial and found guilty over the cost it hid. Ned McIlhenny went to that wild place because the wild place in question was his own island, and he saw with his own eyes what the far end of the trade truly looked like. He was a naturalist, remember, and had been one since boyhood. He had known these particular birds since he was a child, known the great white clouds of them that had once risen and wheeled off the Louisiana marshes in numbers past counting. And when he went looking for them in the 1890s, in the very country that had once been so full of them, he found almost nothing left at all. On his own island, in the marsh he had grown up running wild in, Ned McIlhenny could locate a grand total of 8 young egrets sitting in 2 nests. 8 birds. That was the whole of what remained, on that ground, of a species that had darkened the sky over those exact same waters within his own living memory. 8 young birds in 2 nests, the last small remnant of an emptied world, waiting in a marsh that the feather trade had all but scoured clean of their kind. A lesser man, a man interested only in the source and the growing fortune, would have noted it as a passing sadness and gone home. Ned McIlhenny looked at those 8 birds and decided to try something that had no guarantee whatsoever of working at all. Chapter 12. The source money that saved the egret and the plague it loosed. He built the birds a pond and a shelter and let them go, and then he waited to see whether they would ever come back. That was the whole of the plan, and it was audacious in its very simplicity. He took the 8 young egrets he had found in those 2 nests, and on his own land, on the island, he made them a place to be safe, an artificial pond with shelter and cover built up around it, a protected rookery where no plume hunter with a gun would ever come. He raised the birds through the season, and then, when the year turned and their kind flew south for the winter, as egrets have always done, he opened the way and let his birds go with them, out over the wide gulf and away, having no earthly way of knowing whether a single one of them would ever return to him. It was an act of faith, far more than an act of science, a wager placed on the idea that if you gave the birds just one safe place in all the world to breed, the deepest and oldest instinct of the entire species, the powerful homing pull that draws a bird back to the very water where it was hatched and raised, would do all the rest of the work that no man could do. And they came back. That is the moment the whole long story turns upon, and it deserves to be truly felt rather than merely summarized and passed over. Imagine that you are standing at the edge of that pond in the spring, after the first long winter of not knowing, scanning an empty sky over an empty marsh that the hunters had stripped down to silence. Your birds gone months ago over the horizon, and no promise anywhere that the gamble was anything but a fool's hope. And then you see them, white against the wide blue, coming in low over the water, the birds you raised with your own hands, returning against every odd to the one safe place you made for them in all the wide world, and not only your 8, but others drawn along in their wake. They came back, and they brought more with them, and the more brought more still. season upon season upon season. The colony that Ned McIlhenny had started with 8 birds in 2 nests grew, year after year after year, into one of the true wonders of the American wild. Within about 15 years, the sanctuary he had named Bird City was the summer nesting ground of more than 100,000 egrets, 100,000 where there had once been 8. The whole sky over the island gone white again with the wings of the birds that the hats of the far cities had come within a breath of wiping entirely from the face of the earth. When Theodore Roosevelt, who knew a great deal about both wild birds and the rare men who troubled to save them, came down to see the place with his own eyes, he wrote that the beautiful snow-white lesser egret flourished there by the thousand. And Ned did not stop at the birds on his own island. He used his money and his name and his considerable connections to throw a great protecting wall of preserved land clean around the whole coast. With a partner, he bought 70,000 acres of marshland outright and gave it to the state of Louisiana as a wildlife refuge. He persuaded a wealthy widow to buy 75,000 acres more down on an island along the coast and dedicate it to the same purpose. He worked with one of the great philanthropic foundations of the age to protect tens of thousands of acres more beyond even that. All told, something on the order of 175,000 acres of Louisiana coast were set aside forever for wildlife through the efforts of this one man, a stretch of saved and living marsh larger than a great many cities, paid for and pushed through and protected by a man whose entire fortune had come out of a pepper bottle. This is the family's refusal drawn out to its most beautiful and its most generous length, the strange thread of the whole saga made visible. Ned McIlhenny had a fortune in his hands, and instead of turning it into a still greater fortune, or into the marble and gilt ornaments of a rich man's life, he turned a great part of it back into a living coastline and a rescued species, into 100,000 white birds rising off a marsh that the world had left for dead. The honest teller has to set one hard and strange shadow down beside all of that light, because the very same restless, driving, ungovernable will that saved the egret also loosed on the coast, something that Louisiana is fighting still. Late in his life, in the years just before the Second World War, Ned took up another animal project on the island, a farm this time not of birds, but of nutria, the large South American marsh rodent raised for the fur trade. The animals bred far faster than he could manage or contain, and proved all but impossible to keep penned, and over the course of a few years, whether by their own escape or by his own hand deliberately releasing them, they got out into the open Louisiana marsh, where they had no natural predator to check them. The nutria multiplied into an outright plague. They chewed the coastal wetlands down to bare open water, doing enormous and lasting ecological damage to the very same marshes that Ned had spent so much of his fortune and his heart protecting. And so the man who saved the snowy egret became, by the identical driving temperament, forever bound up with one of the worst invasive pests the state has ever had to endure. Both of those things are entirely true of the same man at the same time, the great conservator and the man who loosed the plague, and neither one cancels or excuses the other. He was a large, contradictory, powerful, and untidy man, and he left the coast both far richer and somewhat poorer for his having lived his whole long life upon it. The wider world eventually caught up to what Ned had done alone. In 1918, a great treaty law finally threw federal protection over the migratory birds of the country, outlawing the killing and the sale of them, and at last closing off the trade that had driven the egret toward the edge. The fashion for the feathered hat faded, the plume hunters lost their market, and the birds, given room and time, came back across much of their old country. The snowy egret today is a common sight again along the coasts and the waterways of the continent. Its numbers back up over 100,000. A bird no longer in any danger of vanishing at all. It is one of the quiet triumphs of American conservation, and Ned McIlhenny's pond on his island, and the 8 birds he raised there and let go, stand near the very beginning of that recovery. A single private act of stubbornness that helped turn a species back from the brink years before the law arrived to finish the job. That is what the source money bought in the end. Not a mansion that would be sold, or a fortune that would be spent, but a living sky full of white birds that is still there to be seen. The scale of the land he threw open a shield around is worth setting down in plain figures. There was the 70,000 acres of marsh he bought with a partner and handed to the state. There were the 75,000 acres more that he talked the wealthy widow Olivia Sage into buying and preserving down the coast. There were the tens of thousands of acres beyond that, brought under protection with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, until the whole came to something like 175,000 acres of Louisiana coast set aside for wildlife, an expanse of living marsh larger than many an American city, saved from the gun and the drainage and the plow. And then there is the shadow, the nutria, the furred rodent he brought to the island and could not keep penned, which got loose into that same coast and multiplied without end, and chewed the wetlands down toward open water, undoing in one place what he had done in another. The same man, the same restless will, protecting a coastline with one hand and loosing a plague upon it with the other. It is the most honest possible portrait of a powerful man, capable of a great good and a real harm out of the very same nature, and it should be left standing exactly that way, unresolved, both halves true. He ran the company for roughly half a century, and he left it, at his death near the middle of the 20th century, larger and stronger and far more modern than he had found it, and still wholly and entirely in the hands of the family. He had inherited the fortune from a father who would never boast of it, and a brother who had left it behind to go to war, and he had used a great part of it to save a species from the edge of nothing, and then he had passed the whole of it on undivided to the generation coming behind him. The next hand to take up the company would belong to a grandson of the founder, a man who, before he ever once sat down in the owner's chair on the quiet green island, would carry wounded men off a hill under fire on the far side of the world, and who would then be asked to make the single largest refusal in the entire history of the family. Chapter 13. The company president who came home from Guadalcanal. Walter McIlhenny earned the Navy Cross on an island in the Pacific before he ever ran the one in Louisiana. He was a grandson of the founder, born in the autumn of 1910, and he came up through the family firm in the ordinary way, beginning his training as an executive around the start of the 1940s. A young man learning by degrees the sauce business that he was expected one day to lead. But before the green island in the marsh ever became his to run, another island on the far side of the world would test him in a way that no boardroom or ledger ever could. Walter had taken a soldier's path early in his life, joining a National Guard unit and then transferring into the Marine Corps Reserve in the middle of the 1930s, well before there was any war in sight. And when the Second World War came at last, the reservist was called up to active duty and shipped out to the Pacific, straight into the hardest and most desperate fighting the Marines would see in the whole of that war. He served 31 months in the Western Pacific with a rifle company of the storied 1st Marine Division, and he was there for the campaign that has become the very stuff of American legend, the long, grinding, brutal struggle for the island of Guadalcanal. It was there, in the late summer of 1942, that Walter McIlhenny did the thing that earned him the Navy Cross, one of the very highest honors his country had it in its power to give a man. Under heavy fire, with enemy mortars and machine guns working the open ground around him, he organized a rescue party and led it out and brought back 9 wounded men who would otherwise have been left to die where they had fallen. Later that same autumn, he led a reconnaissance patrol deep through the dense jungle, feeling out an enemy who might be waiting anywhere in the green and dripping dark. He fought his way through that campaign and through others that came after it, and he paid for it all in the ordinary hard currency of the infantry, wounded more than once, carrying home 2 Purple Hearts in the end, one of them earned later in the savage close fighting on the Coral of Peleliu, where men died by the thousands over a few blasted square miles of rock and sand. He came home decorated as very few men ever are. He held the Navy Cross and the Silver Star both, along with the 2 Purple Hearts, and in time, as he continued in the reserves, he rose to the rank of Brigadier General. But there is a single ordinary object that carries the whole true weight of his war better than any medal or citation ever could, and it sits today in a museum in the city of New Orleans, where anyone can go and stand in front of it. It is his combat helmet, and it is dented, the hard steel of it struck and deformed by the blow of a captured enemy sword. A man who takes the blow of a sword to the helmet and lives, and who keeps the dented helmet afterward for the rest of his life, is a man who has been all the way down to the very bottom of what the world can do to a human body, and has climbed back up out of it. That helmet, dented by a sword on a Pacific island, is the truest measure we have of the man who was about to inherit the family's other island, and the whole quiet fortune that sat upon it. Because that is the deep shape of Walter McIlhenny's life, and it is the very same shape, at bottom, as his own father John's, the man who had left the source behind to charge a hill in Cuba 40 years before. Here, once again, was a McIlhenny who plainly did not treat the fortune as the whole point of his existence on the earth. Walter could very easily have stayed home from the war. He was an executive in training at a prosperous and secure family company, a man with every reason in the world and every possible means to sit the whole thing out in some comfortable and even useful civilian post far from the fighting. Instead, he went to the Pacific and carried wounded men off Guadalcanal under fire, and took a sword blow to the head on some far coral island, and came home at last with the Navy Cross pinned to his chest. The fortune had waited safe for him the whole time on the green hill in the Louisiana marsh. He had gone, and earned something else entirely first, the hard way, the dangerous way, the way the men of this particular family seemed almost compelled by blood to choose, as though the inherited money were never quite enough all by itself to build a whole life out of. It is worth understanding what Guadalcanal actually was, so that the medal is more than a word. It was the first great American land offensive of the Pacific War, a brutal, half-starved, 6-month struggle for a single jungle island and the airfield on it, fought at the very end of a long and fragile supply line. For long stretches, the Marines on that island were nearly abandoned, short of food and ammunition, riddled with malaria and dysentery, holding their thin perimeter against repeated night attacks, while the great naval battles offshore decided whether they would be resupplied or left to die. It was in that furnace, in the late summer of 1942, that a young officer from a Louisiana source family went out under mortar and machine gun fire to bring 9 wounded men back alive. And Guadalcanal was only the beginning of his war. Later would come Peleliu, one of the most savage and pointless killing grounds of the entire Pacific, a small coral island where Marines died by the thousands in a matter of days over ground of almost no value, and it was there that Walter took one of his wounds. The men who came through those places did not talk much afterward about what they had seen. Walter came home with the medals and the dented helmet and the nickname that would follow him the rest of his life, Tabasco Mac, the sauce heir who had gone to the Pacific and proved himself in the worst of it. There is a quiet strangeness in the shape of his two lives that is worth sitting with. For 31 months, a young man crawled through jungle and coral and carried the dying out under fire on islands whose names became bywords for slaughter. And then he came home to another island, a green and peaceful one in a Louisiana marsh, and spent the next 36 years making pepper sauce. The same man, the two islands, the war one and the peace one. He stayed a Marine all his life in a way, keeping his tie to the corps, rising in the reserves to the rank of Brigadier General long after the fighting was over, and he kept that dented helmet as other men keep a photograph. But he did not, by the accounts of those who knew him, talk much about what he had seen and done to earn it. The men who had truly been to the worst places rarely did. He simply came home and took up the family's quiet work, and carried whatever he had brought back from the Pacific privately, the way this family carried most things, without display. The war hero and the sauce maker were the same still figure, and the second life was as deliberate a choice as the first. He came back from the war in the middle of the 1940s, finished out his apprenticeship in the family business, and in 1949 he took the chair that his uncle Ned had held for half a century before him. He became the president of the McIlhenny Company, and from that seat, over the next 36 years, this decorated Marine would grow the little red bottle into a truly global thing, carried into nearly every country on Earth, and he would face, and he would quietly refuse, the single largest temptation that any of them had yet been offered in the whole history of the family. Chapter 14. He could have sold it all and kept it whole instead. When Walter took over the company in 1949, the smart money all said the same thing: take the company public and get rich overnight. It was the great age of exactly that maneuver in American business, the age when family firms all across the country were being carried up onto the stock exchanges one after another, when the founders' grandchildren were discovering that a whole patient lifetime of quiet private building could be turned, in a single afternoon on the floor of an exchange, into a towering mountain of ready cash, simply by selling shares of the family thing to the public at large. And a brand as deeply and widely recognizable as Tabasco, a national name and a growing and genuinely beloved one, would have been a glittering prize on any exchange in the land. Walter McIlhenny and the whole family arrayed behind him could have taken the company public, or sold it outright to any one of the great food conglomerates that were then busily swallowing up the beloved American brands one after another, and become, in a single clean stroke of a pen, enormously and permanently and effortlessly rich. It was the obvious move. It was, very nearly, the expected move. It was simply what people in that exact position overwhelmingly did. He did not do it. Under Walter, the company grew and modernized and reached farther out into the world than it ever had before. And through the whole of it, he kept it private, kept it whole, kept every last share of it held tight in the hands of the family. He grew the brand rather than selling the brand. He remained a Marine to the end of his days, and one of his cleverest strokes as a businessman fused the two halves of his life into a single idea. He created a small cookbook, a tiny waterproof pamphlet of recipes for making the grim military field rations taste like food that a human being might actually choose to eat. Every recipe built around a bottle of Tabasco, and packaged so cleverly that it would slip right inside a ration can and go off to war, folded into a soldier's own kit. It put the sauce directly into the hands of servicemen all over the world, a whole rising generation of them, young men who carried the taste of it home from their wars, and then never once let it go for the rest of their lives. The old soldier sold his sauce to soldiers, and the little red bottle rode into every mess hall and every muddy foxhole of the American military, and then out again into the whole wide post-war world. Under his steady hand, the fortune that the founder had once valued at $14,000 became a global business worth an order of magnitude beyond anything the old banker could ever have pictured from his grave. And Walter never once cashed a single dollar of it out to a stranger. He ran the company right up until the very day he died, in the summer of 1985, still its president after a full 36 years in the chair. He never married, and he left no children of his own behind him. He gave the great bulk of his personal estate to a Marine academy, to the corps that had made him what he was, rather than to any softer or more comfortable purpose. He had been offered, more clearly and more temptingly than anyone before him in the whole family line, the plain chance to turn the entire inheritance into simple, enormous, liquid cash and walk quietly away from it, a very rich man. And he had looked hard at that offer and turned it flatly down, and had kept the thing whole and undivided for the generation coming up behind him. Set his choice against the tide of his own time, and see how strongly he had to swim against it. The middle of the 20th century was the great age of the American food conglomerate, the decades when the beloved family brands of the country were bought up and merged and folded into vast corporations one after another, when the grandchildren of the founders lined up to sell the things their grandfathers had built and to take their profit and walk away. It happened again and again, all across the industry, and almost no one thought the worse of a family for doing it, because that was simply how the story was supposed to end. A recognizable national brand was a thing you eventually sold, at the best price you could get, to someone bigger. Walter McIlhenny sat at the head of exactly such a brand, a name that any buyer in the country would have paid a fortune to own, and every reasonable voice around him would have told him that selling was the smart and the modern and the responsible thing to do. He said no, and he kept saying it, year after year, for 36 years, holding the whole thing private and whole while all around him the other family firms were carried off. It was not a single dramatic act of refusal, but a long, patient, unglamorous discipline of refusing, renewed every single year that he chose not to sell. He was, in the manner of the men of his family, a large and vivid character outside the office as well as in it. He was a passionate hunter of big game who went on safari in Africa and after tiger in India, a lifelong marksman who sat on the committee that oversaw his country's Olympic rifle teams, a man who moved easily among the great cooks of his day and counted famous chefs among his friends, men who prized the little bottle of fire he made and used it in their own kitchens. He never married and had no children of his own, and when he died, his great estate went largely to a Marine academy, to the corps that had made him and that he had never really left. There is something fitting in that final gift, the childless old soldier leaving the bulk of his fortune not to heirs, but to the making of more Marines. His true family, in the end, was doubled. The blood family that owned the source and the core family that had carried him through the war. And he provided for both in his way, keeping the company whole for the one and giving his own wealth to the other. That is the single largest refusal in the whole of this story, and it is worth naming plainly what it cost the family and what it bought them. It cost them the fortune they could have had all at once, the clean and enormous and instantly spendable wealth that a sale or a public offering would have dropped into their laps. It bought them, in exchange, the company itself, kept entire, kept alive, kept theirs, still made on the same green hill in the same marsh, still carrying the founder's own name and his own signature out into the world. Walter chose the harder and the slower and the far less glamorous thing. The thing that made no headlines anywhere and put no sudden mountain of cash in anyone's bank account. He chose simply to keep it, and in choosing to keep it whole, this decorated and childless marine handed down to the next generation of the family not merely a fortune, but the family's oldest and strangest and most valuable inheritance of all, the one that had always mattered far more than any of the money ever had. He handed down the refusal itself, the hard-learned discipline of not selling, passed on intact one more time, like a thing written deep into the blood. Chapter 15. 130 owners, and not one willing to sell. Today, the family that owns Tabasco is not one heir, but roughly 130 of them, and they have never once let a single share leave the bloodline. That is the astonishing arithmetic of the modern company, and it is worth pausing over, because it is the exact opposite of how these stories almost always end. After Walter, the leadership of the company passed on within the family, and it has never once left it, through a long line of cousins and descendants of the founder, men bearing names like Simmons and Osborne, who trace their blood straight back to the ruined old banker on the burned island. The company remains today precisely what it has always been from the beginning, a tightly held private corporation, owned entirely and only by the descendants of Edmund McIlhenny, its shares now divided among something like 130 living family members and closed completely to everyone else on Earth. They do not sell to outsiders. They do not trade on any exchange anywhere. They will not so much as disclose their own finances to the public, keeping the earnings of the business as close and as private as the recipe for the sauce itself, so that the wider world is left only to estimate what Tabasco truly earns, guessing at figures somewhere up in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year, while the family behind it says precisely nothing. They have built a whole quiet discipline around the difficult trick of keeping the thing in the family without letting the family slowly ruin it, which is an achievement all its own, and a rare one, because a firm owned outright by 130 assorted relatives could very easily rot from within into a comfortable nest of idle heirs, all drawing money out of it, and none of them doing any of the work. The family has firmly refused that fate too. The very top of the company is reserved, by long and settled family practice, for a family member, so that the person actually running Tabasco always shares the founder's own blood. But blood alone has never once been allowed to guarantee anyone a soft place at the table. Relatives who could not or would not do the real work have been let go from the company over the years, family or not. And one of the recent leaders of the firm put the guiding principle into words as blunt and as final as a closed and bolted door, saying plainly that the company simply could not go about filling up its ranks with the family's ne'er-do-wells. It is a hard rule to live by, especially among one's own cousins, and it is very likely the exact rule that has kept a 5-generation family business from quietly rotting into a charity for relations. The sheer scale of what those 130 quiet people own between them is an easy thing to lose sight of, so it is worth setting it down plainly and letting it stand. On the island today, the company turns out something on the order of 720,000 small bottles of Tabasco every single day that passes. The sauce is sold in more than 195 countries and territories around the globe, its familiar label printed in dozens of different languages and dialects, so that a bottle bought half a world away from Louisiana still carries that same little red diamond in a script the buyer at the far end can actually read. And the salt in it, still, to this very day, comes up out of the island's own buried dome, the same white mountain that the Confederacy fought so hard to hold, and the Union came in force to smash, cut now to season a sauce that is sold in very nearly every country on the face of the earth. The through line of the whole long story holds all the way down to the present hour, The very same salt that first made and then ruined the founder still runs, quietly, in the product his distant descendants sell to the world. The family has guarded the name as jealously as the ownership. For roughly the first half-century of the company's life, other makers tried to borrow the word Tabasco for their own pepper sauces, treating it as a common term rather than the family's own mark, and the McIlhennys fought them through the courts for decade after decade to establish that the name belonged to them alone. The long battle was finally won in the late 1940s, when a court confirmed the family's exclusive right to the word, a victory 5 decades in the making, and a measure of how completely the family had come to identify itself with the single word printed on its bottles. That is of a piece with everything else about them. They would not sell the company, they would not disclose its numbers, and they would not let go of its name, holding all three as tightly as a family can hold anything across a century and a half. The recipe is a secret. The finances are a secret. The ownership is closed. And the name is theirs alone, defended in court across 2 generations. Everything about the way they run the thing is designed to keep it whole and keep it theirs and keep it out of the reach of the wider world that would happily have swallowed it. The real puzzle, and the real achievement, is how 130 people who all own a piece of the same thing manage to agree, decade after decade, not to sell it. Most fortunes come apart precisely at that point. It takes only 1 generation of heirs who would rather have the cash than the company, only one faction that wants to sell to a buyer waving a check, and the whole thing is carried off and gone. Somehow, this family has kept 130 owners rowing in the same direction for 5 generations, holding to a shared understanding that the company is not to be sold, that the name stays in the blood, that the person at the top must be one of them and must actually be able to do the work. It is a discipline that has to be renewed in every single generation, taught to each new set of cousins, defended against every tempting offer, and it is far harder to keep than any one dramatic refusal, because it asks not one person but a whole sprawling family to keep choosing the same difficult thing together, year after year, forever. That shared refusal, more than the salt or the sauce, is the thing the family has truly inherited and truly kept. One of the recent heads of the company, asked about the very long odds his family has somehow managed to beat, put a cold, hard statistic on the whole thing. Most companies, he pointed out, do not even outlast their own founder or make it as far as a 2nd generation of ownership at all. And only about 12 out of every 100 that are ever started manage to survive all the way to a 3rd generation. The McIlhennys are now on their 5th generation and reaching steadily toward a 6th, still private, still whole, still stubbornly refusing every exit the world keeps offering them. Every single generation of them has been handed, at one point or another, the very same offer the entire age is built to make: the standing chance to turn the whole thing into clean cash and simply be done with it. And every single generation has looked hard at that offer and said no. The founder said his no by never once boasting of what he had built, as though owning it quietly always mattered more to him than trading on it loudly. His eldest son said his no by keeping his share of it to the grave while giving the whole of his life to entirely other things. His grandson said his no in the loudest and clearest way of them all, by refusing outright to sell when selling would have made him a rich man overnight. And now, 130 of their descendants say that same no simply by continuing, year upon year upon year, to hold on to a thing that any one of them could help to turn into a personal fortune tomorrow morning, and choosing instead, together, quietly, not to. And to see just how rare a thing that truly is, you have only to look at what happened to almost every other great fortune of their age. Chapter 16. The Dynasty that Refused to Fall. Every other great Gilded Age fortune tells more or less the same story in the end, and that story is the exact opposite of this one. Take the very largest of them all, the fortune that towered over the whole of the age like a mountain over foothills. When the old Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, died in the 1870s, he was the richest man in all of America, holding a personal fortune of something like $100 million, a sum so genuinely vast that it was said to exceed what the entire United States Treasury itself held in its vaults at the time. His heirs took that mountain of money and built with it the grandest houses the country had ever seen. A whole row of marble palaces marching up Fifth Avenue, and a string of them along the cliffs at Newport, and they filled those enormous houses with the plundered treasures of Europe, and threw within them the most famous and most ruinously expensive parties of the entire age. And then, in the ancient and predictable way of such fortunes, it went. Divided and spent and divided again, poured without end into marble mansions that cost far more to merely keep standing than anyone could bear, scattered among generations of heirs who had never in their lives made a single dollar of it themselves. The great Vanderbilt fortune thinned and thinned across a few short, glittering generations until it was simply gone. By the time the family gathered together for a great reunion in the 1970s, not one of them, it was said, was a millionaire from the old Commodore's money. The palaces had been sold off or pulled down for scrap. The single largest fortune in the history of America had quietly and completely evaporated, leaving behind it little more than photographs of empty, gilded ballrooms. And the Vanderbilts were not alone in it. It was the common fate of the great fortunes of the age, almost the rule rather than the exception. Jay Gould, the ruthless railroad financier, left one of the largest fortunes in America when he died, and in the generations that followed it too, had been divided and spent and scattered among heirs, and in the end, largely dissipated. The hard-won empire of a hard man melting away in the hands of those who came after. Fortune after fortune followed the same arc: the founder who claws the money together, the children who build the palaces, the grandchildren who sell them off and scatter, until the name that had meant the summit of American wealth meant only a street or a building or a faded photograph. The Gilded Age built the greatest private fortunes the country had ever seen, and then, with a kind of terrible reliability, it watched most of them come apart. That was simply what money did across the generations, everyone understood, the way summer becomes autumn. The fortune was a thing you inherited, and then, one way or another, lost. That is the shape the whole age is remembered by. The fortune as a wasting and a melting thing. The dynasty that shines with unbearable brightness and then dissolves entirely into nothing. And against that shape, on a green hill of salt in a Louisiana marsh, one single family did the precise reverse of it at every turn. What destroys a dynasty is not the fortune it makes. It is the day it finally decides to sell what made it. The Vanderbilts sold and spent and cashed out the very thing beneath their feet, over and over, until at last there was nothing solid left under them to stand on at all. The McIlhennys, handed a far smaller fortune and the very same tempting century to spend it in, refused. They refused to boast it away, refused to walk off and leave it, refused to carry it up onto an exchange and sell it to the public, refused every buyer and every offer that came knocking at the door. And by refusing the one exit that had emptied out all the greater houses, they somehow kept the very thing that all those greater houses lost, the company itself, entire and alive and wholly theirs, a full century and a half on from the ruin it grew out of. Look at the whole long line of them laid out together, and the deep pattern in it is simply unmistakable. the founder who would not even trouble to claim the source in the written story of his own life. The son who left the fortune behind to charge up a hill in Cuba and kept his share of it to the grave at Arlington. The naturalist who took the profits of the little red bottle and gave them away to the birds and the marsh. The marine who would not sell the thing when selling would have made him a rich man overnight. The 130 cousins who hold it all now and still, to this day, will not let a single share of it go. 5 whole generations, one single stubborn refusal made over and over and over again on the same 3 miles of ground, until the refusal itself became the family's one true inheritance, worth, in the end, far more than any of the money it kept on turning down. And so the story ends exactly where it first began, on that green hill above the flat marsh, with the salt buried underneath it. Go back one last time to the founder standing there in the spring of 1865, almost 50 years old, thoroughly ruined, with nothing left to his name but the wrecked ground and the white mineral beneath it, looking down at a few red pepper plants come up wild in a broken garden. Every single thing came out of that one moment and that one patch of ground. The source and the fortune and the saved birds and the war heroes and the 130 quiet owners and the bottles standing on tables in nearly 200 countries. And the founder's own hand is still on the whole of it to this very day, because his signature is printed even now across the label of every bottle that leaves the island. The name of the ruined banker who built the thing and would not boast of it, riding out into the world hundreds of millions of times over every single year. The family that owns it now thinks in a far longer measure of time than most people can hold steady in their heads. One of them, asked about the future of it all, described how the company plans not in quarters and not even in years, but in whole centuries. "We do a 100-year plan," he said. "None of us will be here at the end of it, but it allows us to imagine what we could be." That is the true voice of a family that has spent 150 years quietly refusing to cash out, standing all the while on a buried mountain of salt, patiently planning for 100 years that not one of them will live to see. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the glamour and the hidden cost of it and the strange, stubborn people underneath, then subscribe and stay with me, because I have a great many more of them coming. And before you go, I want to hear from you down in the comments. If someone handed you a fortune your own family had held together for 5 whole generations, and selling it would make you rich tomorrow morning, do you honestly think that you would have the discipline to keep on refusing, the way they did, over and over again for 150 years?